This story is titled, My Wealthy Parents Called Me a Burden, Refused to Pay for College, and Abandoned Me. Years later, tried to cash in on my success. Instead, I sued them for $3 million and cut them out for good. Hey, everyone. Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. So, my name's Josh, and I'm 27 now, running my own successful business. Life's good, but when I think back to my childhood, I realize how messed up it was. My parents, Stephen and Diane, were the definition of self-absorbed. They didn't just like their careers, they were obsessed with them. My dad was a hardcore business consultant, always crunching numbers and making deals. And my mom? She ran a chain of high-end boutiques, and her entire personality revolved around the words luxury and exclusive. Sounds like they had it all, right? But here's the thing. They never wanted kids. I wasn't part of their plan. I only existed because their families pressured them to settle down and have a child. They gave in, had me, and immediately regretted it. They didn't even try to hide it. Mom would say things like, "Do you know how many opportunities I missed because I had to be a mother?" Or, "If I didn't have to deal with you, I'd be dominating the West Coast fashion scene by now." Dad was worse. He'd look at me and go, "You've set us back years. If you hadn't been born, we'd have been so much further ahead." Yeah, they really said stuff like that. To my face. Growing up in that house was like being tortured all the time. They were constantly busy with their businesses, so I was basically left to raise myself. If I needed help with homework, they'd brush me off. "Ask your teacher," Mom would say, barely looking up from her laptop. And Dad? He'd mutter something about how he was building an empire and didn't have time for my childish problems. I'd watch other kids at school get picked up by their parents, who'd ask them about their day or cheer them on at events. Meanwhile, my parents couldn't care less. They never came to a single parent-teacher conference, school play, or science fair. It wasn't just neglect, it was complete disinterest. And when they did pay attention to me, it was only to criticize. I was a straight A student, but they never acknowledged it. Instead, they'd mock me for being into computers. "What kind of job are you going to get with that?" Mom would sneer. "Fixing laptops at a mall?" Dad would laugh and say, "You're not cut out for the real world. You'll never make it." But the worst part was how they treated me like I was the reason they weren't more successful. They acted like having me ruined their lives. If they were fighting about business, it always somehow circled back to me. Mom would shout, "If I didn't have to waste time on Josh, I'd have expanded by now." And Dad would reply, "He's a drain on us." We should have stuck to the plan. No kids. When you're a kid, you don't really understand what's wrong, but you feel it. I remember thinking, why do they hate me so much? For years, I thought it was my fault, that maybe if I was smarter or better at sports or less weird, they'd love me. But that didn't happen. The turning point came when I was about 16. My aunt, Laura, who's my dad's younger sister, visited us. She was one of the few family members who saw through my parents' perfect facade. We got along really well, and one day, I just broke down and told her everything. How my parents treated me, how they never supported me, how they blamed me for their setbacks. Laura wasn't surprised. In fact, she told me something that made everything click. She said, "Your parents never wanted a kid, Josh. They only had you because their families kept pressuring them. They've always resented you." Hearing that was like a bit hurting, but it also made things clearer. Their cruelty wasn't about me, it was about them. They saw me as an obstacle, not a person. After that, I stopped trying to win their approval. Why bother? Nothing I did would ever be good enough for them. Instead, I started focusing on myself. I threw myself into my studies and started thinking about how I could get out of their house and build a life of my own. The thing is, my parents didn't just ignore me, they actively tried to sabotage me. When I started applying for colleges, they told me they wouldn't pay for tuition, even though they could afford it without blinking. I begged them, saying, "This is my future." But Dad just laughed. "You don't have a future," he said. "You'll end up fixing computers for minimum wage." That moment was the last straw. I knew I couldn't rely on them for anything. If I wanted a future, I'd have to build it myself. By the time I was 17, I'd started saving up from odd jobs and tutoring gigs. I knew it wouldn't be enough, but I was determined to leave. My parents didn't care. In fact, they encouraged me to leave as soon as I graduated high school. "Don't let the door hit you on the way out," Mom said with a smirk. I packed my bags and moved in with Aunt Laura a few weeks before my 18th birthday. She wasn't rich. She worked in sales and lived in a modest apartment, but it felt more like home than my parents' mansion ever did. Laura had something my parents never did: compassion. When I first arrived, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "Josh, I can't promise to fix everything, but I'll help you as much as I can. You're not alone anymore." And you know what? For the first time in years, I actually believed someone had my back. The first hurdle was figuring out college. I'd been accepted into a decent university, but with no financial support from my parents, paying for it felt like climbing Everest with no gear. Aunt Laura immediately got to work. She wasn't the type to wallow or wait around for miracles. She sat me down at her tiny dining table and said, "We're going to apply for every scholarship grant and loan out there. If there's free money floating around, we're getting it." It wasn't easy. Most scholarships were highly competitive, and a lot of them required essays, interviews, or proof of financial need. The essays were fine. I had enough material to write a best-selling memoir about my parents' neglect, but convincing people I was deserving was harder. My parents' income disqualified me from many financial aid programs, even though they weren't giving me a dime. I remember one particular day when Laura and I were filling out applications. She looked at one of the forms, sighed, and said, "It's insane how your parents' money counts against you when they're the last people who'd actually help." She wasn't wrong. It felt like the system was rigged against me. Eventually, after weeks of writing essays, gathering recommendations, and jumping through bureaucratic hoops, I managed to secure a few scholarships. One of them covered 80% of my tuition, which was a massive relief. The remaining 20%? Laura insisted on covering it herself. I argued with her about it. I didn't want to be a burden, but she shut me down. "Josh," she said firmly, "helping you isn't a burden. You're family." Living with Laura wasn't just about survival. It was also about healing. She wasn't afraid to call out my parents' behavior for what it was: abusive. She'd say things like, "Josh, it's not normal for parents to treat their kid like a business liability," or "You deserved better, and it's okay to be angry about that." Those conversations helped me realize that the problem wasn't me, it was them. While Laura was helping me with college stuff, I was also working odd jobs to save up for living expenses. I took on everything from tutoring high school students in math to working the late shift at a local diner. It was exhausting, but it felt good to earn my own money, even if it wasn't much. When college finally started, I moved into the dorms. It wasn't glamorous, just a small room with peeling paint and a roommate who snored like a chainsaw. But I didn't care. I was finally out of my parents' shadow, and that was all that mattered. At first, I struggled to adjust. College was overwhelming, and I constantly felt like I was behind everyone else. While other students were going to parties or joining clubs, I was working part-time jobs to make ends meet. But slowly, I found my rhythm. I focused on my classes, built relationships with my professors, and started making friends. One of the first friends I made was Alex, a fellow computer science major who shared my love for coding and bad sci-fi movies. We bonded over late-night programming sessions and greasy takeout, and eventually, Alex introduced me to his group of friends. These people weren't just classmates. They were driven, ambitious, and supportive in a way I'd never experienced before. Over time, we started brainstorming ideas for projects, and one of those ideas turned into the tech company we run today. But back then, it was just a side hustle, a way to practice our skills and maybe make a little extra cash. None of us realized it would eventually become something big. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents was non-existent, which suited me just fine. They didn't call, they didn't check in, and they definitely didn't care about what I was doing. The only time I heard about them was through Laura, who occasionally mentioned their social media posts or family gossip. Apparently, they were still living their picture-perfect lives. But every once in a
throwing
while, I'd feel
extravagant
this
parties
pang of
and
anger.
pretending I didn't
Not because I
exist.
missed them, I didn't, but because I knew they were probably telling their friends some twisted version of the truth. I could imagine them saying, "Josh chose to leave," or "We gave him everything, but he wanted to go his own way." The thought of them rewriting history like that made my blood boil. I wanted to confront them, to call them out for their lies, but Laura always advised against it. "You're doing great on your own, Josh," she'd say. "Don't let them drag you down." By the end of my first year in college, things started to look up. I was excelling in my classes, my side hustle was gaining traction, and I finally felt like I had a purpose. But the most important thing? I proved to myself that I didn't need my parents. Every success, every step forward was mine and mine alone. Leaving their house had been the hardest decision of my life, but it was also the best one. For the first time, I was free to be who I was, without their constant criticism and negativity weighing me down. That year, I made a promise to myself. I would never let them back into my life. No matter how successful I became or how much they tried to worm their way back in, they would never get another chance to hurt me. Looking back, I think that decision, the decision to cut them out entirely, was the moment I truly started to heal. By the time I hit my senior year in college, my life had done a complete 180. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. My side hustle with Alex and a few other friends had turned into something bigger. What started as a small software project in our dorm rooms was gaining traction. Companies were noticing us, and we were getting emails from people who wanted to pay for our services. It was surreal. I remember the day we landed our first big client. We were crammed into Alex's tiny apartment, surrounded by empty pizza boxes and Red Bull cans, when the email came through. It was from a mid-sized logistics company that wanted a custom solution for streamlining their operations. The contract? $50,000. We all just sat there for a minute, staring at the screen. Then Alex jumped up and screamed, "We're doing this!" That deal was the turning point. We registered our company officially, and within months, we were juggling multiple clients. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Balancing school, part-time jobs, and the growing demands of the company was exhausting. There were nights when I barely slept, running on caffeine and adrenaline. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was building something that mattered, something that was mine. I didn't hear from my parents during this time, which was honestly a relief. Laura occasionally mentioned them in passing, like when they threw some extravagant gala or made a big donation to a local charity for the press coverage. But other than that, they were a non-factor in my life. Then came graduation. I wasn't just graduating, I was valedictorian. That was a moment I dreamed of for years. Standing on that stage, giving my speech, and looking out at the crowd felt like validation for everything I'd been through. I made sure Laura was in the front row. She was practically bouncing in her seat, grinning from ear to ear. She'd been there for me through everything, and seeing her proud made the moment even sweeter. But guess who decided to crash the party? Yep, Steven and Diane. They didn't reach out to me beforehand, didn't ask if I wanted them there. They just showed up. I spotted them outside the auditorium, mingling with other parents like they were part of the celebration. It took me a second to process what I was seeing. They were all dressed up, Mom in one of her designer dresses, and Dad in a suit that probably cost more than my tuition. I walked right past them on my way in, pretending I didn't see them. I wasn't going to let them ruin my day. After the ceremony, I planned to meet up with Laura and my friends to celebrate. But as soon as I stepped outside, there they were. Mom was all smiles, waving me over like we were best friends. "Josh, darling, there you are." I didn't even try to hide my annoyance. "What are you doing here?" I asked. Mom's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "We wanted to be here for your big day. It's such a proud moment for the family." Family. The audacity of that word coming out of her mouth almost made me laugh. Dad chimed in, "You're valedictorian. That's a huge achievement. We wouldn't miss it for the world." I stared at them for a moment, trying to decide if they were delusional or just plain selfish. Probably both. "You didn't even know I was valedictorian," I said. "You're here because it looks good for you, not because you care about me." That hit a nerve. Mom's smile vanished completely, and Dad's face turned red. "That's not true," he said, but his tone wasn't convincing. "Really?" I shot back. "Because the last time I saw you, you told me I didn't have a future. You kicked me out, refused to help with college, and now you're suddenly proud parents? Spare me." Laura stepped in at that point, probably sensing I was about 2 seconds away from making a scene. "Josh," she said gently, "let's go celebrate with your friends." I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving them standing there looking stunned. That night, I celebrated with Laura, Alex, and the rest of my friends. We went out for drinks, laughed until our sides hurt, and toasted to the future. My parents? I didn't give them another thought, but they weren't done. Over the next few weeks, they tried reaching out. They sent emails, left voicemails, even sent a handwritten letter, which was definitely Mom's idea. Dad wouldn't bother. In all of them, they claimed they just wanted to reconnect and be a family again. I wasn't buying it. They'd made it clear my whole life that I was nothing more than an inconvenience to them. Now that I was successful, they wanted back in? Yeah, no. At first, I ignored them. But then they started getting bolder. One day, I got a message from a mutual family friend congratulating me on my success and mentioning how proud my parents were. Apparently, they'd been telling people that they'd always supported me and were instrumental in my achievements. That was the last straw. I sent them a single email. "Do not contact me again. I'm done." From that point on, I made sure they were completely cut off. No phone calls, no emails, no chance for them to insert themselves into my life. Looking back, that period was one of the most important in my life. I realized that success isn't just about what you achieve, it's about who you surround yourself with. My friends, my aunt, and the team I built with Alex were my real family. Steven and Diane, they were nothing more than strangers who happened to share my DNA. I thought I was finally free of my parents. After graduation, I moved to a new city, set up shop with my business partners, and started focusing on growing the company. Life was finally falling into place. My relationship with Laura stayed strong. My friends became like family, and business was booming. But of course, Stephen and Diane couldn't stay out of my life for long. It started with a random phone call. I almost didn't answer because the number wasn't saved in my phone, but something told me to pick up. "Josh, it's your mother," came Diane's voice, dripping with fake warmth. I hadn't heard from her for over a year, but her tone instantly brought back memories of every manipulative conversation we'd ever had. "What do you want?" I asked flatly. "We've been hearing about your business. It sounds like you're doing really well," she said. I could feel where this was going, but I let her continue. "Your father and I have been thinking," she said, her voice taking on that tone she used when she was trying to sell an idea she knew wasn't going to land. "We'd like to invest in your company. We could bring so much to the table. Connections, advice, financial backing. It's the perfect opportunity for all of us." I couldn't help but laugh. "You've got to be kidding me," I said. "No, we're serious," she replied, her tone growing defensive. "We've always believed in your potential, and now that you've proven yourself, we think it's time to put the past behind us and work together as a family." That was it for me. "You want to work together as a family?" I said, my voice sharp. Where was that energy when I was applying for colleges, or when I was living off ramen in my dorm because you refused to help? You're only interested now because you think you can make money off me." Diane sputtered, trying to come up with some excuse, but I hung up before she could finish. I thought that would be the end of it, but I should have known better. The next day, I woke up to an absolute mess. My phone was blowing up with messages from Alex and my other business partners. They'd all seen the same thing. A Facebook post from my parents, tagging not just me but also my company and everyone associated with it. The post was a masterpiece of lies and manipulation. They claimed I was a fraud, that my company only existed because of their generous financial support, and that I had cut them out of my life after using their money to get ahead. They made it sound like I was some spoiled brat who had turned my back on the people who had given me everything. And because they tagged my business partners, clients, and even some of our investors, the post got traction fast. Comments started pouring in,
furious,
with people either
It wasn't just a
congratulating my
personal
parents
attack.
for raising such
It was
a
a direct
successful
threat to
son,
my livelihood,
or questioning
my
my
business
character
was
based
my
on their
life.
story, and they were dragging it through the mud to boost their own egos. After I calmed down, after Alex convinced me not to throw my phone out the window, I knew I needed to respond. But I didn't want to stoop to their level and get into a public argument on Facebook. That's not how I operate. Instead, I decided to let the truth speak for itself. Here's the thing. I had receipts. Back when I was still living with my parents, I started recording videos of their behavior. At first, it was just for my own sanity, a way to remind myself that the things they said and did weren't normal. But as time went on, I realized those recordings could be my shield if I ever needed to prove how awful they were. I had footage of Diane berating me for wanting to go to college, Stephen telling me I'd never amount to anything, and both of them openly admitting they wished I hadn't been born. I uploaded those videos to my public Instagram account, along with a detailed post explaining the reality of my relationship with my parents. I laid everything out, how they never wanted me, how they kicked me out when I turned 18, and how they were now trying to profit off my success. I didn't hold back, but I also didn't embellish. The truth was damning enough on its own. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, the post went viral. People were sharing it, commenting in disbelief, and calling out my parents for their lies. The tone of the conversation shifted fast. Suddenly, everyone was on my side. But the fallout for Stephen and Diane was brutal. Their friends, their colleagues, and even their clients started distancing themselves. I heard through Laura that the backlash was so bad that Mom had to shut down her boutique's social media accounts because of the hate messages pouring in. Good. Meanwhile, I wasn't done. I contacted my lawyer, Sarah, and explained the situation. She took one look at the Facebook post and said, "This is defamation, plain and simple. We're going to sue." Sarah didn't mess around. Within days, she filed the paperwork, citing not just the harm to my personal reputation, but also the damage to my business. Alex and the rest of the team were fully on board. They'd seen the impact firsthand, with clients pulling out of deals and investors hesitating to move forward. When my parents were served with the lawsuit, they freaked out. I got a series of frantic voicemails from Diane, alternating between tearful apologies and angry accusations. Stephen, of course, took the tough guy route, leaving a single message that said, "You're making a big mistake, Josh. This won't end well for you." "Sure, Dad, because your track record with predictions has been so great." I didn't respond. I let Sarah handle everything while I focused on damage control with my business. My partners and I reached out to every client and investor personally, explaining the situation and providing proof of the truth. It was a lot of work, but it paid off. By the end of the week, we had regained most of the trust we'd lost. My parents, on the other hand, were starting to realize they'd seriously miscalculated. When the lawsuit hit my parents, they didn't just lose their minds. They lost any sense of strategy. Instead of laying low or hiring a good lawyer to handle things quietly, they went full chaos mode. They started calling everyone in the family, crying about how I was ruining their lives and trying to paint themselves as the victims. The irony? They hadn't spoken to most of these relatives in years. Suddenly, Stephen and Diane were reaching out to everyone from distant cousins to my mom's estranged sister, pleading for sympathy. They even had the audacity to call Aunt Laura, trying to guilt her into convincing me to drop the case. Laura, being the absolute badass she is, shut them down immediately. She told them, in no uncertain terms, that they had no one to blame but themselves. "Josh owes you nothing," she said. "You made your bed. Now lie in it." Then she hung up. Meanwhile, I stayed focused on the lawsuit. Sarah was working overtime, gathering evidence, filing motions, and prepping for what was shaping up to be a major legal showdown. She assured me we had a solid case, but she also warned me that my parents would try every dirty trick in the book to avoid taking responsibility. She wasn't wrong. About a week after the lawsuit was filed, my parents launched their next attack. They tried to undermine me publicly again. This time, instead of another Facebook post, they started contacting local media outlets, pitching themselves as the misunderstood parents of a ruthless tech CEO. One of the smaller local papers actually ran their story. The article was a mess, full of half-truths and outright lies. It described me as an ungrateful son who had turned his back on his loving parents after they sacrificed so much for him. They claimed they'd supported me financially through college, a total lie, and that I had cut them off for no reason. When I saw the article, I was furious. My parents weren't just attacking me anymore. They were actively trying to destroy my reputation in the community. I sent the article to Sarah, and she immediately added it to our defamation case. But I wasn't just going to sit back and let them control the narrative. I decided it was time to escalate. The next day, I sat down with Alex and my other business partners to discuss our strategy. They were all on board with going public again, this time with more clarity and context. "People need to know the whole story," Alex said. "You've been way too nice for too long." So, I made another Instagram post. This time, I didn't just share the videos. I shared screenshots of text messages and emails from my parents dating back years. Messages where they called me a waste of time and money, where they refused to help with college, and where they explicitly said they didn't care about my future. I also addressed the local newspaper article directly, refuting every single lie they'd told. I included receipts, bank statements showing I'd paid for college myself, letters from my scholarships, and even a heartfelt note from Aunt Laura that she'd written me during my first semester. The post blew up. Within hours, it had tens of thousands of likes and comments. People were outraged, not just at my parents, but at the newspaper for running such a biased story. Other outlets picked up the post, and suddenly, the narrative shifted completely. My parents were getting roasted online. People flooded their social media accounts with comments calling them out for their lies. Diane deleted even her personal profiles, and Stephen's LinkedIn profile mysteriously disappeared. It was clear they were feeling the heat. Then came the emails. Diane sent me a long, rambling message, alternating between apologies and veiled threats. She claimed she'd only gone to the media because she felt cornered, and said she never meant to hurt me. She begged me to take down my posts, saying the backlash was destroying their lives. Stephen, of course, took a different approach. His email was short and angry. "You're playing with fire, Josh. If you don't stop this, we'll sue you for slander and invasion of privacy." I forwarded both emails to Sarah. "Let them try," she said with a smirk. "They don't have a leg to stand on." The legal proceedings officially kicked off 2 weeks later. My parents had finally hired a lawyer, but it was clear they weren't prepared for what was coming. Sarah was a shark in the courtroom, tearing apart every weak argument their lawyer tried to make. The evidence we presented was damning. The videos, the text messages, the emails, the Facebook post, it all painted a clear picture of who my parents really were. Even their lawyer seemed embarrassed by the end of the first hearing. At one point, Diane tried to speak directly to the judge, claiming she'd been misunderstood and that I was exaggerating. The judge shut her down immediately. "This isn't the time for personal statements," he said. "Let your lawyer do the talking." It was glorious. By the time the mediation phase rolled around, my parents were desperate to settle. They knew they couldn't win in court, and they were bleeding money trying to fight the case. Their lawyer approached Sarah with an offer. They'd pay $500,000 in damages if I agreed to drop the suit and remove my posts. I laughed when Sarah told me. "Not a chance," I said. "They've done too much damage for that to even come close." Sarah went back with a counteroffer. $3 million. No negotiation, no concessions. They'd pay the full amount, publicly apologize, and stay out of my life for good, or we'd take it to trial. After a few days of back and forth, they caved. The day the settlement was finalized felt unreal. I sat across from Sarah in her office, staring at the final paperwork. Stephen and Diane had agreed to pay the full $3 million, issue a public apology, and best of all, they were legally barred from contacting me ever again. When Sarah handed me the pen to sign the papers, I hesitated for a second, not because I had doubts, but because this moment was so much bigger than the money. It was about standing up for myself, proving that they couldn't control me anymore. Once I signed, it was done. No appeals, no second chances. They were out of my life, for good. Their public apology was everything I hoped it would be. Awkward, forced, and completely humiliating for them. It was plastered on their social media accounts for everyone to see, where they admitted to their lies, manipulation, and the harm they'd caused me and my business. The comments under their posts were savage. People called them out for being terrible parents, fake philanthropists, and all-around awful human beings. Diane ended up disabling comments after a few days, but the damage was done. Their social circle was gone. Their reputations were in shambles, and no amount of spin could fix it. They'd lost their credibility, their connections, and their ability to manipulate people. As for the $3 million, it went to good use. A big chunk went straight into my business, allowing us to expand faster than we'd ever planned. I also made sure Aunt Laura was taken care of. I gave her enough to pay off her mortgage and sent her on the vacation of her dreams, a month-long trip to Italy. She cried when I told her, but honestly, it was the least I could do for the person who saved my life when I had no one else. Since then, life has been peaceful. My business is thriving, my friends are still by my side, and I've built a life I'm proud of. For the first time, I feel like I'm in control of my own story, instead of living in the shadow of Stephen and Diane's selfishness. Do I ever think about them? Sometimes. I wonder if they regret the choices they made, or if they're still sitting in their big house, blaming me for everything that went wrong in their lives. But honestly, I don't care. Their opinions, their lies, their existence, it's all irrelevant to me now. So yeah, that's my story. A little messy, a little chaotic, but it all worked out in the end. To anyone dealing with toxic parents or family, don't let them define you. Build your own life, surround yourself with people who actually care about you, and don't be afraid to fight back when they try to tear you down. Anyway, thanks for your time, Redditors. Time to grab a drink and enjoy this life I built for myself.